Tonight, we are wrapping up a series we've been in for the past couple of weeks called Do It Scared. And throughout this series, we've been talking about courage. We've been talking about what it looks like to live courageously, to live a life of courage, to take a step that you've never taken before. And we've made this really important clarification that this series is not about eliminating fear from our lives, because that's difficult to do and that's not really helpful. And if you're scared of something, there's a good reason why you're scared of something. This series is about overcoming fear in our lives, because that's what courage is. It's not that courageous people don't feel fear, quite the opposite. They feel fear, but what makes them courageous is that they take a step forward anyway. In other words, courageous people do it scared. And what we've kind of landed is that courage and comfort can never coexist. You cannot be courageous and comfortable at the same time. It does not make any sense, because when you are choosing to take a step of courage, you want to step into the unknown. You're going to step into what God might be calling you to do. You're going to take a step towards an opportunity. You're going to take a step towards a destination. You're going to take a step towards a person. And when it's unknown, when you don't know how it's going to play out, when you're kind of outside of your comfort zone, that is really, really uncomfortable. But what we've been trying to convince you of is that on the other side of what scares you the most is a God that wants to grow you, stretch you, love you, give you purpose, and even heal you. But if we finish this series out without talking about what we're going to be talking about today, it would be really, really incomplete and really, really unfair. Because the worst thing that we could do is end this series and leave you to believe that, hey, if you just take a step of courage, if you just do it, man, I'm telling you, everything is going to work out for you and it's going to be awesome. The worst thing that we could lead you to believe is that if you just were to take a step of courage, you know that God is with you and everything is going to work out the way that you hoped, the way that you planned, and everything is going to be awesome. You know that's not true. And if you don't know that's true, you're going to find out that that's not true tonight. But here's the interesting thing about living courageously is that the initial step of courage is not the hardest part of living courageous. Living courageously, step number 1 isn't the hardest. The hardest step is step 5, step 6, and step 7. Because you know this, the beginning of a journey is never the hardest part. The middle of the journey is always the hardest part. I mean, have you ever been excited about something and you were like all in? You're like, man, let's go, I'm gonna get this, let's go. You're so excited, you were ready, and then you jumped into it and you started going, you started moving, and then all of a sudden it was like, what did I just get myself into? You're halfway through and you're like, I can't do this. I'm not capable. I'm in way over my head. What in the world? This is not what I expected when I signed up for this. That's what some of you guys feel every time you try to put together IKEA furniture for your room. This is way too complicated. Like, the Bible is less complicated than these instructions, people. You put your bed together, you got 6 pieces left, you're like, well, I'm afraid to go to sleep at night, you know? For some of you, it's exactly what you feel whenever you sign up for that elective that you think is going to be easy, you know? When I went to UGA, the thing that tricks you, meteorology, that'll be easy. Wrong. Hardest class available in college is meteorology. They get you every time, right? And then you take that first test and you're like, so much for an easy elective. Okay, too late for drop ad. You know, like, there's just nothing that you can do. The first time I experienced kind of being excited about something and jumping right in and then realizing it was a bad idea was in the 2nd grade. First time I experienced it in my life, at least first time I remember. I grew up playing soccer. It's what Arabic kids did, okay? It's what they do, actually. Like, that's all. We got one sport, pretty much. And, but in the 2nd grade, I remember some of my best friends at the time, Brad and Adam and Connor. If you ever hear this, you guys are the reason why this story is true. They all played baseball. So, you know what? I'm gonna drop soccer for one fall. I'm gonna do fall ball instead. I'm gonna do baseball with my friends. And I was so pumped. And I was so excited. And I was so ready. I was like, man, I'm gonna get this. I'm with my friends. And let me tell you, it was absolutely awful. There's a reason why there are no Arab people in Major League Baseball. Go find one. You can't. We don't do it. We don't even play cricket. Like, we don't do anything with a stick and a ball. It was awful. I was so bad. Y'all, there were times multiple times where I struck out and stayed at the plate. My coach had to come get me. The only time I ever made it to base, it was one time. The stupid pitcher walked me. I'm like, bro, you could have done anything better than that, you know? It was so bad. I was so afraid I was gonna get hit. I'm like, why aren't the coaches pitching? I don't trust these jokers, you know? And I'll never forget, one night, I was supposed to pitch. I was like, this is bad. This is bad. So I told my mom to call the coach and tell him I was sick. And that's what she did. And I didn't go. And I never went back. Like I was sick for the rest of the season. I had malaria and I couldn't do it. Like I got the swine flu. Like I was out. Coach Parker, what was his name? I'm sorry. I mean, I was done. I literally quit. I couldn't do it. I never went back. I don't even think I got a trophy, which is dumb. I should have got a trophy for that junk, man, just so I had something. But it was awful. And I was so pumped and I was so excited. And then halfway through, I was like, no, I can't do this. I'm so bad at this. What was I thinking? I am out. And for so many of us, when we take that initial step of courage into the unknown, into a challenge, into a new opportunity, towards what God might be calling us to, we're ready to go. We're ready to make it happen after that first step. But what happens when after that first step, we run into something difficult? Like what happens when it gets hard? Because here's what I can promise you, is that when you take a step of courage, when you choose to follow where God might be leading you, when you take a step of courage, that first step might be hard, but here's what I can assure you is at some point you're gonna face some kind of adversity. At some point, no doubt, you're going to hit a wall or a roadblock and you're gonna start to wonder whether or not you went down the right road. You're gonna hit a challenge bigger than yourself and you're gonna start to wonder whether or not you made the right decision. And for some of you, there'll come a point where you fail and you're gonna start to wonder whether or not this was the right opportunity. You're gonna wonder how you can come back from the failure because you're not sure how. For some of you, you're gonna be in the middle of it and your expectations of what you thought it would look like were so radically different that you're left wondering, what in the world did I get myself into? This is not what I expected that it would be like. For some of you, you're gonna bump into haters. You're gonna bump into people that you don't like very much. You're gonna bump into people that are difficult to work with. You're gonna bump into people that are really, really hard to love, and you're wondering, this is what I took this step for these people? For some of you, you're gonna get into a situation where you feel like the odds are completely stacked against you, and in those moments, it's going to be a lot easier and require less energy to just quit and walk away rather than just keep going. Because everything is smooth until it's not. And everything is going according to plan until it doesn't. And it's in those moments, in the middle, when you take a step, when you move forward and start to realize, what starts to happen is that your passion and enthusiasm starts to wane. That thing that you were excited at first and you were passionate and you were all about it and you're like, man, I'm gonna do this, like I'm ready to go. I'm gonna do it scared. Here we go, God is with me. All of a sudden you hit a roadblock, you hit some adversity, and that starts to wane a little bit. And then when that starts to wane, you start second guessing. You start second guessing you. You start second guessing your abilities. You start second guessing gifts. You start second guessing God. You start second guessing whether or not God is even with you or whether or not He even called you to this. And then when you start second guessing, quitting is on the verge. Turning away and walking away is right on the verge. So what do we do? Because, man, I want you guys to live a life of courage, and I want you to do it scared, and I want that for me too. But what do we do when we get into the middle and it's hard and it's difficult and we don't know how to get through it? It's challenging. That job was harder than you thought. Leadership is lonelier than you thought. Following your convictions is more challenging than you thought. Working with those people was more aggravating than you thought. What do? How do you keep going in the middle when everything inside of you wants to stop? How can we begin to cultivate resilience to be able to bounce back and to keep going when we fail? What does it look like to have a resolve to commit to the process and to keep on going no matter what we face? Now, I really believe that God's gonna take you wherever he wants you, and there are times in life when God is gonna close doors, he's gonna take you where he wants to take you. That's not what I'm talking about tonight. I'm talking about when we are moving in the direction that God might have us and we hit something difficult. What do we do then? To answer that question, to answer what should compel you and I to keep on going, I wanna look at something that the Apostle Paul wrote. The Apostle Paul wrote a couple of letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy, to a good friend of his named Timothy. That's what those are. In fact, a lot of the New Testament are just letters, most of them by the Apostle Paul. And Paul and Timothy had a really, really close relationship. Timothy became a Christian on one of Paul's missionary journeys. And Paul saw something in Timothy. And he said, hey man, I see potential in you. I want you to be with me. And so he brought him on to be his personal assistant. And so he traveled with Paul on his missionary journeys. And so Paul started investing in Timothy. And really Timothy kind of became like a spiritual son to Paul. And Paul became Timothy's spiritual father, a really, really close relationship. But Paul saw more in Timothy than a personal assistant. He saw gifts, he saw abilities. And so what he told Timothy was, hey man, I've got something for you. This personal assistant thing isn't working out anymore. You're great at it, but I got something bigger. He said, hey, I want to appoint you. I want to leave you in Ephesus, and I want you to be a leader of the church right there in Ephesus. And so Paul left him and he did that. And what we know about Timothy, because of the 2 letters that Paul wrote him, is that Timothy struggled. Timothy was very timid by nature. He shied away by nature. He tended to back down by nature, and he lacked confidence. He lacked confidence in himself. He lacked confidence in his gift and his abilities. And he was really insecure about his age, because Timothy was really, really young, and here he is leading a church of a lot of people that are not young, some of them older, and he's having to deal with things that he's never dealt with before, trying to earn the respect from older people that think they know them. So he's very insecure about his age, and it got to a point where Timothy was ready to throw in the towel and quit. Hey, I'm just gonna rejoin Paul on the road trip around the world and tell people about Jesus. Let me just get back on the tour bus, Paul, because that'll be easier than this. And so Paul wrote him these letters to give him direction and much needed encouragement to keep on going. In 2 Timothy, the letter we're gonna look at tonight, this is such a cool perspective to look at when you read this letter. It's the last letter that Paul wrote before he died for his faith. It's the last letter he wrote. It very well could have been the last thing that he wrote before he was martyred in Rome for his faith. And you have to imagine, if anybody understood what it looked like to take a step of courage and to keep on going through hardships, it was the Apostle Paul. I mean, the guy went through it all. The guy went through all the hardships. The guy was beaten within an inch of his life often. The guy was shipwrecked. The guy was imprisoned. In fact, some of the New Testament letters, like Philippians, he wrote while he was in prison. The guy went through it all. If there's anybody that knew what it took to be resilient and to bounce back and to keep going no matter what you face, it was the Apostle Paul. And so I just imagine, he knows he's about to die. And right before he loses his life for the gospel that he gave his life to, he writes Timothy this letter, a guy that he loves so much, a guy that he traveled with, ate with, laughed with, cried with, spread the gospel. He writes him this one last letter saying, hey, Timothy, I know that it's hard, but I am telling you, this might be the last chance I get to tell you, keep going. And so many of us find ourselves where Timothy is. We took a step, and it's hard, and we want to quit. And what Paul says to Timothy, I think speaks to you and to me as well. And he writes this in Timothy chapter 2 Timothy chapter 1, starting verse 3. Paul writes, I thank God, whom I serve as my ancestors did, with a clear conscience. As night and day, I constantly remember you, Timothy, in my prayers. Recalling your tears, I long to see you so that I may be filled with joy. And then he says, I am reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I, persuaded now, lives in you also. I know you're struggling, Timothy. I know you're going through a hard time, but I'm reminded of your faith. I'm reminded that you know there is a God that is in control. I'm reminded that there is a God that you've given your life to. So because I am reminded of your faith, Timothy, for this reason, he goes on to say, I remind you to fan into flame. I remind you, Timothy, because I know that it's easy to forget when things get hard. I want to remind you because I know you want to quit whenever it gets difficult. I want to remind you because you've got people that you're trying to lead that don't respect you. I want to remind you of what is true because you're starting to believe the lies. I want to remind you, he says, to fan into flame the gift of God, which is in you through the laying on of my hands. I love this. I want to remind you to fan into flame the gift of God. Hey, Timothy, I know that you're struggling. And I know you feel inadequate. And I know you don't feel capable. And I know you don't know how to handle these people. And I know you just want to give in and quit. But Timothy, I want to remind you that God has gifted you on purpose and for a purpose. That God has you where he has you and he's gifted you to do what you're supposed to be doing. And just because you're facing adversity doesn't mean that your gifting no longer applies to that situation. I want you to, in other words, keep using your gifts. Don't neglect your gifts. Keep on going. And some of you here need to hear tonight that God has uniquely gifted you for this unique season that you are in. That God has uniquely gifted you for a work and a purpose that he wants to do in your heart and through your life. But just because he's gifted you to do something and to take a step towards something and to be a part of something does not mean that you're not going to face adversity when you get there or along the way. And I love what he says. He says, fan into flame. You know what fire tends to want? I want you to think about fire for a second. Fire has a tendency to go out. You thought about this? If you've ever sat in front of a fireplace or a bonfire, you get the fire going, you Boy Scouts, and you get it, or Girl Scouts, and you get it going, and then after a while, what happens? The fire starts to go out. What do you have to do to the fire? You have to stoke it. You have to fan it to get the flame back up occasionally. It's like whenever you're stoking or fanning the fire, you are reminding it what it's capable of. And that's what Paul is doing here with Timothy. I want you to fan into flame the gift that you have. I'm telling you. Because there's nothing like a little bit of adversity to start to dampen your passion and to start to make you second guess and question where God has you and what he wants to do in you. So he says, hey, I want you to fan into flame the gift. Don't stop doing what God has placed you there to do. Why? He says this, the reason I want you to do that, for God did not give us a spirit of fear. No, he gave us a spirit of power and love and self-control. Hey, Timothy, the reason why I don't want you to stop using your gifts, the reason why I want you to keep going, I want you to fan into flame the gifts that he has given you. The reason why I don't want you to let adversity or haters or self-doubt to get in the way of the gifts that God wants to use is because God did not give you a spirit of fear. No. Whenever we are living in fear, that is because we are living in fear. That is because we are choosing to let fear rule. That's not of the Spirit, that is of us. But the Spirit that God gave you, Timothy, is one of power, love, and self-control. In other words, the Spirit that God put inside of you, his Spirit, the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead, that Spirit that lives inside of you, it doesn't manifest in your life fear when you are walking and surrendering to it. No. It manifests in your life power. It manifests in your life love. And it manifests in your life self-control. Not fear, not cowardice, not timidity, but power, love, and self-control. And I find it so interesting that Paul used those three virtues. He didn't give you a spirit of fear. No, he gave you a spirit of these three things. So what about these three things uniquely compel us to continue to move forward even in the face of adversity and difficulty and hardship and unmet expectations? Paul, the first one he says is, hey, it's not a fear of spirit, but it's a spirit of power, he says. Power. Now, when you think power, I don't mean like Thor, okay? It's not like the Avengers, like strength, like I don't need to go in the gym anymore, spirit of power, let's go. Like that's not what this means. I would love that. So would my wife on my behalf. But he means spiritually strong. That the spirit that God gave you makes you spiritually strong. That the spirit that God gave you, I love this idea, it gives you spiritual grit. Spiritual grit. What I mean by that? That the spirit that God gave you keeps you from being wavering and wobbly. That the spirit that God gave you keeps you from being shook and shaken whenever things get difficult. Because we have a proper view of the bigness and the power of God. This power is not from us, it comes from God. See, we get spiritual grit, this spiritual staying power in the midst of whatever we're facing because we have a proper view of God. That in the midst of our difficulty, in the midst of the hardship, in the midst of how hard it is, in the midst of the unmet expectations, we weigh that on a scale up against how the confidence that we have of how big God is, and the bigness of God wins. The bigness of God wins. That we know he is bigger than this hardship. He's bigger than that roadblock. He's bigger than that setback. He's bigger than the fact that I don't feel capable because I know that he is with me. It gives us spiritual staying power when we have the right perspective of who God is and who it is that is with us. A great picture of this, the Apostle Paul talks about this. He wrote another letter, he wrote a ton of them in the New Testament, to a church in Corinth. And this is what he said in 2 Corinthians chapter 9. Verse 12, he says this. He says, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away. We don't know what the thorn was. A lot of people speculate a bunch of different things. I think it was some kind of physical ailment. It might have been a sickness. It might have been some kind of physical disability. But here's what we know. It was something that hindered Paul. It was something that got in the way of Paul being able to do his ministry well, and it was something that he pleaded with the Lord to take away. But he didn't. Instead, Paul said, but the Lord said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. That little Greek word power is the very same word that Paul used when he wrote to Timothy about the power that the Spirit empowers in you and in me. That same power that Paul was talking about here was the same power he was encouraging Timothy with. And he says, this is Jesus talking, for my power is made perfect when you are weak. He says, I'm not going to take this ailment away, but I'm going to give you the grace to get through it. And here's what Jesus was telling Paul. And here's what Paul understood is that Jesus' divine power in your life and in my life is most clearly seen and displayed on the backdrop of our weakness. Jesus' divine power is most clearly seen and most clearly felt on the backdrop of our weakness and our shortcoming. So oftentimes, God isn't just gonna take the thorn away. No, he wants an opportunity to show you who he is, that his grace is sufficient, that it can make us content. His grace is sufficient and that his bigness is seen. His power is seen in our weakness. And it completely changed Paul's perspective because he goes on to say this. He says, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness. This is what Paul said. This is crazy. So that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul's perspective totally shifted. The grace that God gave him to get through it, where he could see the power of God in his life, changed his perspective to where the things that should get in his way, the things that should aggravate him, the hardships and the insults and the persecutions, he saw them, he welcomed them. He boasted in them. Why? Because it was an opportunity for Jesus to do something amazing in his heart and in his life. Paul knew that at the end of his rope, Jesus was most clearly seen. And here's what I want you to know is that in the midst of that difficulty, at step 5, 6, and 7, when you're faced with something that you can't handle, when you want to run, when you're faced with something that seems bigger than yourself, Paul would say, lean into that weakness by leaning into Jesus, because in your weakness, that's when you're really strong, because that's when you're really depending on God. And sometimes God will allow the thorn. We'll take a step of courage and he'll allow the difficulty. He'll allow the adversity. He'll allow the persecution. He'll allow the challenges. You know why? Because you're gonna grow. You're gonna grow in that. You're going to mature in that. Here is what I've learned. I'm still learning every single day in my faith and in my ministry and in my life, is that while God works through you, he also works on you. That while God works through you, he's using you for a purpose. You're doing something awesome. You're stepping into courage. Guess what? He also is going to work on you. He's never done working on you. He's never done working on me. That here I am, I get to lead a college ministry, and every day he is working on me. He's working on my insecurities. He's working on my self-doubt. He's working on me, setting my minds on things that I don't need to be setting on. He works on me and he works on you, refining until the day that we die. So he's gonna give you that thorn. It's not always gonna be easy and a clear road, because he wants you to grow. In fact, this is so hard for us to see because we literally can't see it. That God will give you adversity in the midst of you taking a step of courage, because he's preparing you for something 5 years from now that you don't know is coming. He's preparing you for something 10 years from now that you don't know is coming. He's preparing you for something 15 years from now that you don't know is coming. And one day you're gonna look back and be like, oh my goodness. That's when I learned. That's when I saw. That's when I started. I get it. Because while he works through you, he's always going to work on you. And his Spirit will empower you to be spiritually strong, to have that spiritual grit and have that spiritual staying power, so that no matter what you face, you can head it on in the confidence of the power of God that is with you even when you are weak. Paul says he's also given you a spirit of love. This is a big one. We talked a little bit about this last week, but a spirit of love, a spirit of unconditional love. That as you step into courage, as you step towards a calling, as you step towards an opportunity, you are going to be in a path, unavoidably so, where you are going to be called to love people that you don't want to love. In fact, if you're a Jesus follower in the room, you are called to love everybody. And if you're a living, breathing human being, there are people in your life that are really, really hard to love. People that you disagree with, people that frustrate you, people that disappoint you, people that will want nothing to do with you, people that disgust you, people that are against you. And Paul is saying that the Spirit that God gave us empowers us to love even them. Jesus, in his most famous Sermon on the Mount, says this in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 43. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. It's the Old Testament, Old Covenant. Jesus has said, I'm bringing something new. I'm going to up the ante. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and send rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. Love your enemies. Love those that persecute you. I gotta be real, man. I really struggle here. That we're supposed to love people, that you're gonna be called to something, that you're gonna step into something, you're gonna step into courage, and you're gonna inevitably bump into people that are really, really hard to love. People who are living a lifestyle and leading a lifestyle and making decisions that you fundamentally disagree with, you're called to love. Love doesn't mean agree. Love doesn't mean affirm. Love means to love. Love means to support. Love means to be there. That there are going to be people in your life that you're going to be called to forgive. And even though they hurt you, love would say to give. That you're gonna be called to love people that are needy, selfish, and just straight up annoying. And this is the one I struggle with the most. You are called to love people, and God will put people in your life that you need to love that have hurt people that you love. Man, I struggle with that, bro. Woo! Refinement. My sister is walking through something right now, and there's somebody that hurt her, and I'll be honest, I don't want to love that person. I want to rip that person's throat out. I'm so serious. I'm not bragging about it. I'm just being honest. It's refinement. Like, man, you want to mess with people that I love? Papa Bear's going to come out, and I can't really fight, but I got a big old bark, you know? Like, if you hurt people on my team, man, I get really protective. My family, God forbid you mess with my wife or my daughter, I'm going to go to jail. But good thing me loving other people does not depend on me, because I'll tell you what, I would not love very well. But the Spirit that God gave me, the Spirit that lives in me, empowers unconditional love to flow through me. The Spirit that God gave you empowers unconditional love to flow through you. Thank God it's not up to us, because this world will be a lot more ugly than it already is if it was. And His Spirit will empower you to do so. And then the third one, and the last one, He's given you a spirit of self-control. A spirit of self-control. That word self-control, it means to have a wise head. It means to have good judgment, to be prudent, to think about a situation before you respond. By nature, you know what we are as humans, reactionary. We react to things. And for us, when we get in the midst of something difficult, we get in the middle of trying to walk in courage, and something happens, adversity comes up, our reaction is just I'm gonna run away. Our reaction, our reflex is just to run, to get away, to react, to get to safety, to get more comfortable. But Paul is saying that the spirit that God gave us is one of self-control, where we can pause and think in wisdom, not just in emotion. I love what Solomon writes in Proverbs 14:15. He says this: the simple believes everything, but the prudent gives thoughts to his steps. That word simple means someone who is naive and gullible. How easy is it to be naive and gullible in the midst of working through difficult adversity and walking through something hard? That the simple believe that life is a fairy tale and everything always works out the way that it should. The simple believes that nothing could ever go wrong. The simple believe that the hardest part of a journey is the beginning of the journey. The simple believe the lies that the enemy starts whispering into your ear, into your heart whenever you get in over your head. And he starts telling you you're not good enough. He starts telling you that you can't. He starts telling you that you need to back away. That the simple start second guessing themselves and God the second something starts to go wrong. The simple react and often regret. The simple make judgments just based on circumstances and forget that God is even in the picture at all. But the prudent, the ones who use wise judgment, the prudent understand that things sometimes go wrong. In fact, the prudent expect things to go wrong. The prudent seek wise counsel from other people before just reacting to something. The prudent look at the bigger picture. The prudent, rather than reacting and regretting, the prudent process and respond well. The prudent creates space for the Holy Spirit to speak to our hearts and lead and direct our steps. And the prudent, they understand that sometimes plans change. You know what the prudent are like? The prudent are like a rubber band. Rubber bands are so fun. I love rubber bands. When I was in middle school, it was cool just to wear one on your wrist. Is that still a thing? No. And you always had those spawns of Satan that would come around and pop your wrist. The rubber bands are so fascinating because you can stretch a rubber band, you can bend a rubber band, you can twist a rubber band, you can knot a rubber band, and when you're done, it's always, unless you pop it, that'll ruin my illustration, but a rubber band is so resilient. A rubber band will always bounce back to where it was. I mean, you can do whatever you want, and it's always going to bounce back to where it was no matter what it's facing. It's so resilient. Do you know what makes a rubber band so resilient? It's flexible. The prudent understand that plans change. The prudent understand that things aren't always going to go the way that we expected, and God never promised that they would. The prudent understand that when faced with something hard, I'm gonna sit back, I'm gonna intentionally give this some thought, and I'm gonna figure out what the best course of action is. That the Spirit of God literally empowers you to control yourself so you don't run away whenever things get hard, whenever things get messy, whenever things get difficult. No. It stays the course. It sees clearly, and it acts and responds accordingly. So the Spirit that God gave you and me is not a spirit of fear, not of timidity. It doesn't give us a spirit that backs down. No, the spirit that God gave you is a spirit of power, of love, and of self-control. Timothy, I know that it's hard, but I'm telling you, man, this might be the last time I get to tell you anything. This might be the last time we get to communicate. I'm telling you, man, keep going. You don't have to go alone. Because not only does God go before you, not only is God behind you, but He is in you. And His Spirit is going to empower you. His Spirit is going to lead you. And whatever God has called you to, no matter what you face, He's going to see you through it. So Timothy, don't stop now. Because you have no idea what's at stake if you did. And I'm here to tell you the same thing. Leading a life of courage is going to be uncomfortable. It's going to be hard. It's going to take you to places that you never thought that you could go and never thought you could get out of. But you have no idea what hangs in the balance if you choose to back down, if you choose to quit, if you choose to let fear overcome you. Because you have no idea what hangs in the balance of your yes. You have no idea what hangs in the balance of your no. You have no idea what hangs in the balance of your forgiveness, of your leadership, of your influence, of you taking a step in a direction that you never thought you'd take, of changing your major even though your parents aren't really for it, of choosing to step in a direction that God is calling you. You have no idea what hangs in the balance if you quit. And I'm not promising you it's not going to be hard. I'm telling you that it will be. I'm telling you there will be adversity. But here's what I can promise you, is that the Spirit God gave you empowers you to persevere no matter what you face and love no matter who you face. That the Spirit of God that lives inside of you is going to empower you to persevere, to keep going, no matter what you face, no matter what it is. And that same Spirit is going to empower you to unconditionally love no matter who you face. And I'm telling you, if this group of students right here, if this generation of students believed that and walked in that Spirit, you're going to change the world. I'll never forget. It was right before I was moving out to Dallas. I mentioned that to you all in week 1. It was one of the scariest things I've ever done. I didn't want to go. I wanted to stay. I wanted to find a job. I wanted to do the comfortable thing. And I got a text from a friend and a mentor of mine, kind of like a Paul, if you will. And I'll never forget the text. I wish I had an iPhone so I could have screenshotted it. Couldn't screenshot on razors. And he sent me this text. And I've just carried it in my heart for so long. And man, I hope that when y'all are like 30 years old, in college, is like, oh yeah, I remember college. I remember this thing at the living room. This weird Arabic guy that used to preach. I don't remember his name. But I remember something that he said, I hope this sticks with you like it stuck with me. Average is normal. Greatness is rare. Do hard things. I'm telling you, you can go to college and you can get your degree and you can get a cool internship and you can get a good job and you can have a good life. I don't want you to have a good life. I want you to have a great life. I want you to walk into the greatness that God has for you. And not greatness by the world standards, but greatness by eternity standards. That you were a part of something bigger. You were a part of the story of God. You were a part of the redemption of humanity. You were a part of loving the lost. You were a part of calling and stepping into and leading those to Jesus who were apart from Jesus, of walking in God's call on your life. But that can't happen if we stop when it gets hard. That can't happen if we stop whenever there's a roadblock. But the great thing is, we don't have to. You know why? Because the Spirit God gave you and the Spirit God gave me, if we were to lean into that Spirit, if we were to believe in that Spirit, if we were to surround ourselves with people that would call out that Spirit in us, just like Paul did to Timothy, that Spirit in you, it's going to empower you to persevere no matter what you face. And it's going to empower you to love no matter who you face. And so with every ounce of who I am, I'm telling you, average is normal. Greatness is rare. So in the name of Jesus that conquered death and wants to lead you into fullness, do hard things. Heavenly Father, thank you that when you see us, you see more. Thank you that when you see us, you see potential. Thank you that when you see us, you see a work that you want to do in our hearts and through our lives. And I just pray, Father, that for the students in this room tonight, that it might be a turning point. That tonight might be the night where they don't back down, they don't turn away, but they resolve to keep on going. That they take a step into the calling that you have on their lives in a way like never before. And I pray that in Jesus' name, you would do a great work. That you would lead them through adversity, that you would lead them through difficulty. And on the other side, they might have a clear picture of who you are and why you put them here. In the matchless name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.